So on behalf of the town and our other co-sponsors, the Palm Beach Civic Association, the Citizens Association of Palm Beach, the Preservation Foundation, and the Garden Club, I'd like to welcome you all to our Where Have All the Songbirds Gone?
Thank you so much, Kirk. Thank you for having us here today. And thank you to all of our experts who've flown in airplanes from points unknown. So the panel is called Where Have All the Songbirds Gone? Named after a song, which some of you may remember from the early 60s. But as you were walking in, you heard some songbirds in the recorded audio track. They can be heard in West Palm and West, but they're just not here on Palm Beach, and there's a reason for that. And that's what our panel is going to explain to us today. So we'll start with Doug. Doug Tallamy is a professor of entomology and wildlife ecology at the University of Delaware. He's author of a book called Bringing Nature Home, which has become a Bible to many of us.
Okay, thank you. Pleasure to be here. Life as we know it depends on insects. And if insects were to disappear, the following things would happen. First of all, we would lose most of our flowering plants. And if we lost most of our flowering plants, energy flow through ecosystems would change entirely. And the food webs that support amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals would collapse, so they also would disappear. The earth would start to rot because insect decomposers would be gone. And of course, humans would disappear as well. So a somber message. We killed insects at home. We killed insects in our agriculture. And again, we didn't worry about that because we were convinced that there were a lot of natural areas out there that were loaded with insects. Everybody knows insects are everywhere. There are two reasons why that is no longer true today. And you're looking at one of them. There are not enough natural areas left out there to house the number of insects that we actually need. And that's because we have designed those spaces for our own use. We have our cities, and of course they're not designed to support insects. We have our suburbs, they're not designed to support insects. Even our rural areas are not designed to support insects. 1/2 of the Earth's surface is now dedicated to agriculture, and that is not designed to support insects. The second reason that our natural areas are not doing a good job with insects anymore is that most of them are thoroughly invaded with plants from South America and several other places. And as we'll learn, plants from someplace else are very poor at supporting local insects. So we are winning our undeclared war against insects. The good news is we're finally starting to recognize this. You may have seen this headline in New York Times. It's the third time that the New York Times has run articles about collapse of insect populations. And we're starting to get real numbers to support this. We're losing our bee populations, our native bee populations. The big one is that 45% of our insects globally have disappeared since 1974. 45%. So almost 50% of the creatures that are keeping us alive are now gone. And I notice you're not running around the room screaming and pulling your hair out, because it's really tough to convince people that there are real risks out there. We have buffered our lives to the point where we just, we can accept it intellectually, but a large part of us just believes it's not going to happen. The question now is, are there still enough insects in the temperate zone to balance that risk equation? The sad answer is that in most places, no, there are not enough insects for two reasons. One of them, we spray them every chance we get, we kill them. But we've also taken away the plants that make those insects. We've traded them for ornamental plants from someplace else that are not good at making insects. Here's a study that we just had published recently. We counted caterpillars in those hedgerows in a standardized way, in hedgerows that were invaded with non-native plants, and we compared it to the caterpillars in hedgerows that were all native plants. They were not invaded with anything. Okay, the invaded hedgerows had 68% fewer species of caterpillars, 91% reduction in the abundance of caterpillars, and this is the big one, 96% reduction in biomass. So the amount of food available for the birds that are eating these caterpillars was reduced by 96%. In other words, we take all the food away when we allow these plants to come in and replace our native plants. So which birds is this affecting? It's more than half of the birds that breed in North America. There are 386 species of neotropical migrants. and they no longer have enough insects to justify their migration. It's our swifts and our swallows, our orioles, our hummingbirds, our vireos, our tanagers, our buntings and flycatchers and thrushes, and that is why we now have 432 species of North American birds that are threatened with extinction. We now have 1.5 billion fewer breeding birds today than we had just 40 years ago. I don't need to remind you that a billion is 1,000 million. That's a lot of birds that aren't here anymore. A world without insects is a world without biological diversity, but a world without biological diversity is a world without humans. And that's why this is an important message, whether you like birds, don't like birds, whether you live in Beijing or in Manhattan, it doesn't matter. We need biological diversity because that is what runs the ecosystems that support us. So our only viable option is to live sustainably with the natural world that sustains us. There really is no other option. How are we going to do this? Thought a lot about this. We're going to do it individually. 83% of the entire U.S. is privately owned. But that means private landowners are now going to be important components of conservation. We do have parks, we have preserves, but they are not big enough. They are too separated, too isolated from each other to sustain the biodiversity that we need in the future. So conservation is going to happen on private properties. And we have to do that or we're going to lose it. It's not optional to not use properties like this, which means we have to raise the bar about what we're asking these landscapes to do. In the past, well, in the present too, we ask our landscapes to be pretty. And we're good at that. We know how to make them pretty. And when we go to the nursery, we look for plants that are beautiful, and maybe they can be a screen or an anchor or a focal point. I know you guys have a lot of problems with your screens around here. But look, on the other side of the seesaw there, we're not choosing plants based on their ecological roles at all. It's all been about aesthetics. And when we landscape like that, when we think of plants only as decorations, landscaping equals ecological destruction. If you do that on a small scale, that's okay. But when we do it everywhere, it's not okay. But we could balance our seesaw here. We could find pretty plants that support food webs, that protect watersheds, that store carbon, that create all the ecosystem services that we need, we humans need, to survive, that have good pollinator habitat, that support natural enemy communities, that keep our pests in check. This is absolutely possible. And when we choose plants based on function, then landscaping equals ecological restoration. And that's where we have to go in the future. We do want to preserve the little pieces that are left, but we need to put so much back from what we've already taken away. And we can't restore ecosystems anywhere without restoring the insect populations within them, because insects are critical to ecosystem function. So, what does it take to make an insect? It takes energy, and that energy comes from the sun, and it's captured by plants, so we're really talking about plants. We need plants to make our insects, to run our ecosystems. Which insects should we make? Well, I think the two most important groups of insects are the ones that maintain plant diversity and the ones that contribute the most energy to food webs, that are taking energy from the plant and passing it on to other things. So I'm really talking about pollinators and caterpillars. 96% of our terrestrial birds in North America are rearing their young on insects, and most of those insects are caterpillars. So how do we increase the number of caterpillars in our yards? Well, it's a no-brainer. We're not going to spray our yards because then we don't have any. So if we come to that agreement, is that going to be enough? And the answer is no. 90% of the insects that are out there are what we call host plant specialists. They pick one lineage of plants and they get good at getting around, circumventing the particular defenses of that particular lineage. They develop behavioral adaptations and life history adaptations, physiological adaptations, but it takes a long period of exposure to those plant lineages for all that to happen. Plant choice matters. That's what this is all about. Luna moth needs sweet gum. If I want the 8-spotted forester moth, I have to have native grapes. The green marvel comes with viburnum, imperial moth on pine, spotted thyrus on clematis, spiny oak moth, solitary oak leaf miner. This is my favorite, the spun glass caterpillar, and literally plus hundreds more, because I wanted to emphasize how fast you can bring these creatures back. Field sparrows, because we have oaks making red-line panapoda, phoebes nesting on the light bulb over my front porch, because we've got native grasses making skippers. So it works. That's the point. Which plant should you put in your landscape? 5%, just 5% of the local native species are making about 75% of the food. Those are the ones you have to have in your landscape if you want to have a successful food web. And if you don't, we're not fooling the birds. So, by choosing the right plants, using more of them, we actually can make insects almost everywhere. And even though all of us here, many of us here saying, yeah, I want to save half the earth, how is this possible? Remember, half the earth is already in agriculture, and we're in the other half. All of our infrastructure, our 4 million miles of paved roads in North America. We have an area the size of New England in lawn right now. How are we going to save half the earth with structures like that? Well, we're going to change our approach to conservation. In the past, we have conservation has been humans here and conservation someplace else. We're going to do nature someplace else. Well, there's not enough someplace else's anymore. So now we do want to save all of the pristine areas that are left. It's not very many, but now we have to do conservation where humans are. In other words, we have to do it where we live, where we work, where we play, and to a lesser degree where we farm. The UN designates biosphere reserves as places of ecological significance, and that wording drives me nuts because every place on planet Earth has ecological significance, including your yard. It counts totally. Remember that 85.6% east of the Mississippi? That's where we're going to do this conservation. That's where you're going to do it. You don't have to save biodiversity for a living, but you can save it. You really must start saving it where you live. And what I like about this approach is that it empowers each one of us. Now you're an active player in the future of life on Earth. It also shrinks the problem down to a manageable, something that's manageable. We got a lot of problems out there. Don't worry about all of them. Just worry about life on your piece of the world, and things will be better. So, as a property owner, the future of conservation is truly in your hands. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Doug. What a report. That was amazing. I can't imagine that so many of the birds that we heard in the soundtrack at the beginning, the warblers and the buntings, might disappear because we haven't fed them well enough where we are. So I really appreciate that. Thank you. Next up, we have Edwina Van Gaal. She's an American landscape designer based in East Hampton, New York, and founder of the Perfect Earth Project, promoting chemical-free gardens and the use of native species.
Thank you. Thank you all. I have been designing landscapes for an incredibly long time, and I am extremely lucky because I live in this spot, and it's my inspiration. It's my sanity, basically. And then things in my beloved neighborhood started to show signs of distress. This is toxic blue-green algae on Georgica Pond, one of the most expensive real estate places in the world, and on Lake Agawam in Southampton. This is what is happening now. This started happening about 5 years ago. And I thought, well, oh dear. What am I going to do about this? Because I have a feeling that my own profession may play a role. So I decided to ask my clients to do this with me. What are you using? And what if we switched to chemical-free? And they said, sure, just make sure it doesn't fail. And actually, it did not fail. It worked remarkably well. And I learned a lot. I found out that chemicals are used a lot more than I had ever dreamed. American residential properties use 2 to 4 times more pesticide per square foot than agriculture. Golf courses, 8 to 10 times. But they're also really more dangerous than I ever imagined, because not only were they disturbing our waterways, but they're really bad for us. Landscape chemicals are now associated with autism and cancers, endocrine disruption, nervous system disorders, asthma. New York Times a couple of weeks ago had an article on how the blood-brain barrier is now assumed to be not as impenetrable as they thought. And pesticides probably are involved with dementia. So I decided, I've got a dog, I've got a grandson, and most people do. And so what could I do? So I started the Perfect Earth Project, and what we do is raise consciousness, because there really wasn't any place for people to go to get advice on, well, how the heck am I going to do this? And so we raise consciousness about the problem. And then the big challenge is we are trying to make education available, widespread, for people to find people to do it for them or how to do it themselves. How to do a landscape without harmful chemicals. And what's the big barrier here? Is everyone afraid of dandelions? And actually they are, because the American public has been regularly subjected to very sophisticated marketing. So the largest reason in surveys for why people use chemicals on their properties is peer pressure. It's just that simple. People are endangering their health and their environment because of peer pressure. How can we make it exactly the opposite? Because the other thing people are afraid of is their landscaper. Because their landscaper is probably telling them, it's going to cost you a lot, and it's not going to work, and your place is going to fall apart. It's going to be a giant mess. And so how did this all get to be like this? So what it was that at the end of the Second World War, we became equipped not only with the GI Bill and the American suburb, the American lawn, because that was made possible by some wonderful new chemicals that were now available. They were war surplus and they were cheap. And so an industry was born in which there was no knowledge of how to grow, but how to kill. A few species would be selected, one of them turf grass, that everybody liked, and everything else gets killed. This is not a group of people, I don't feel, that began an evil campaign to destroy us. But each time one of the chemicals of the past was proven to be dangerous, a new, more sophisticated, more target-specific chemical came on the market. So everybody was fine with that. But unfortunately, evidence is occurring to the contrary, because now we're learning about something called the gut biome. So you have 10 times more fungi, bacteria, and even tiny insects operating inside of you than what you might call you. But if you killed them, you would die, and you'd only lose a couple of pounds. So don't try it. But when their ability to operate is impaired, your digestive system stops working well, your immune system starts working well, and your brain stops working well. So they're really key. And all of these wonderful microbes, they're doing the same thing in the soil for plants. So the moment you start spraying with something that kills plants or fungi or insects, you're doing damage way beyond the visible. There are so many unintended consequences. I still find that there are an awful lot of people walking across a toxic lawn to get to their organic kale. But the fact is that a toxin-free landscape is based on something that I call, and I'm not alone in this, a nature-based process. If you don't change your practices and you just switch one drug for the other in a way, even if it's organic, doesn't mean it's doing the whole job, then it will be more expensive and it probably will not work. The key is to understand what plants need to thrive and feed the biome. If you have a healthy biome, your chances are you're like way ahead of where you are now. So a naturally based landscape does often look a lot more exuberant. We hope that. It can be fairly formal, doesn't have to be, but still the plants are allowed to express their natural shapes. Or they can be largely native, but the big thing is your soil and the soil biome. You need to water deep when you water, and you need to let your lawn dry out. Mowing higher is one of the simplest things you can do, and big, tall leaf blades, they outcompete weeds. It's really pretty simple. Taller leaf blades also mean deeper roots. Deeper roots, stronger plants, more resilient. Having more lawn than you actually need is a waste of resource. To fill all that space that you're not using, think like area rug instead of wall to wall. But have your lawn size match what you use, and then put the rest to plants that have ecosystem function. Whenever you have landscape waste, you keep it on your property, you mulch it, you split it up, or you find a place to put it and you bring it back. Plants are social. They want to be touching. They want to be together. And keep in mind that lawns and landscapes can be diverse. Your lawns that are a monoculture, cut short, well, it's kind of time we got over that, isn't it? Like, I don't see a single person here in a suit. I bet nobody's wearing a girdle. And, and there is certainly nobody like smoking. This all would have happened in the 50s. So why do our lawns and landscapes still look like the 50s? Everything else in our culture has changed. And we're stuck to this weird, old-fashioned approach, which is suppress and kill. Why not go wild? You know, this is a landscape I did for someone who is very exacting, as you can see by the house. But the entire plant palette was taken from the surrounding woodland. It needs almost no care. But the big challenge for me, how can we engage the landscape profession? How can they be leading this charge? How can the landscapers be the person who are saying, I have to manage this landscape, I don't want to be exposed? So we want to go from this to this. Because a lot of people want that sign out there. They want to know you were there. They want to know you did something. My favorite landscapes were designed by nature, so invite her in. And make a commitment to your property that you will do it no harm. You have been living together. It's time to get married. No cheating. Thank you.
Hi. So my name's Dan Rochelle. I am an attorney with the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm here today to talk about pollinators. A pollinator is an animal that moves pollen from one part of a plant to another, or from one plant to another, allowing those plants to form seeds and reproduce. Pollinators are responsible for a third of the food on the planet. Here's a picture of a grocery store. Here's a picture of that same produce aisle in a grocery store without pollinators. 85% of the world's plant species require pollinators to reproduce. So without pollinators, we have ecosystem collapse on a catastrophic scale, on an apocalyptic scale. This came into popular consciousness, I think, when we started to see honeybees die. So here's a chart of honeybee losses. It's a bunch of different factors. So one is climate change. Another are parasites, particularly for honeybees. This is a picture of a varroa mite. It sort of attaches to the bee and sucks the life out of them. There are diseases like nosema. This is a fungus that affects bees. Habitat loss to monocultural farming and also to urban and suburban sprawl. And then last but certainly not least, the use of pesticides. And one of the reasons that pesticides are of particular interest for some of the losses that we saw with honeybees is the way that bees were dying. There's actually 4,000 species in the United States, more than 300 species just in Florida. And they come in all sorts of neat shapes and colors and brilliant greens. This is a carpenter bee from Florida, a bright orange color. There's a mason bee also from Florida. One of our favorites is the rusty patch bumblebee. So this bee, as recently as the early to mid 1990s, was one of the most common bumblebees in the United States. Since that time, it has lost about 90% of its population, and it recently was listed as the very first bumblebee on the endangered species list. And really, it's not just bees, right? What's happening to bees is happening all across the insect kingdom and the animal kingdom at large, and the consequences are potentially huge. These pesticides, you may have heard of them, neonicotinoids or neonics. They target insect neurons, overstimulate them, and ultimately they destroy them. They're also what's known as systemic insecticides. They permeate the plant tissues. The plant itself becomes the pesticide. It's incredibly water soluble. It dissolves easily in water. So if there's a rain event, there's an irrigation event, those pesticides will move through soil. If there are adjacent wildflowers, those pesticides can be soaked up by the wildflowers, making the wildflowers poisonous. It also very readily gets into water. So, and to give you a sense, just because these pictures are great, these are what some crop seeds look like today. Those aren't natural colors. Here's sort of a close-up of some corn seed with a neonic seed treatment. And as you can see, in 1992, 1993, this pesticide didn't exist, and now it's virtually ubiquitous in large parts of the country. To give you a sense of how well this lines up with bee deaths, here's another pesticide that was approved. This is a major neonic, clothianidin. It's used very heavily on corn. And as you can see, It comes on the market around 2004, 2005, 2006 when we see this spike in bee deaths. And they're building up year after year after year because they're staying in the soil. We're seeing neonics in water supplies across the country, particularly in the Midwest. But they're here in Florida too. And if you have crops that are treated with neonics, those pesticides are getting into the fruit or the vegetable or the product, and you can't wash them off because they're literally inside. And if bees are visiting the flower, it's getting into the honey as well. So bringing this home, because I know I talked a lot about agriculture, it's important to know that those maps that I showed were just maps of where neonics are being used in agriculture. A lot of those white spaces would be filled in if they also were tracking residential uses, because these pesticides are omnipresent through home garden products. It's a particular concern in urban and suburban areas because these pesticides are approved at higher rates than they are at farm fields. And we know that people are using them at higher rates, often not reading the label. Shockingly, you find more of these pesticides in the waterways in urban and suburban areas than you do even in rural areas and agricultural areas. It's so important to do what you can within your own community, because neonics are so extensively used on such large areas of land in other places in the country that urban and suburban areas have an opportunity to be a safe haven. But they won't be unless we change the way that we manage our property. And it's really simple. The two things that you can do to help pollinators, very, very easy. Plant native plants and a diversity of native plants, and don't use pesticides. Don't use neonics, don't use other pesticides.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dan. That was fascinating. Someone reminded me that I should let this group know that Ficus benjaminus, who many of us have in our gardens, it requires neonic pesticides. Keep that in mind. It's an opportunity. Okay, next we have Paul Brazil, the Director of Public Works for the town of Palm Beach. He's the manager of the Green Initiative, maintaining a healthier and toxin-free environment on town property, parks, and public spaces.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much. I've actually got some good news. We manage your public spaces. We've got about 45 acres of town property that we're responsible for. We've stopped using glyphosate. Turns out that we kill a lot of weeds.
Yay.
Palm Beach is a very, very attractive place, and we were spending a lot of time and effort and money and applying a lot of chemicals. We've completely eliminated that, and we're looking for alternatives right now can we torch it? Can we hand pull it? How often do we have to do it? So it's a new approach to doing it. So we are literally in the beginning of the experiment. But as we figure these things out, we're writing a set of specs for our vendors. We contract out a large amount of work, and I'm sure the people sitting here hire people to do their lawns. We're writing a set of really, really tough specs that meets our green initiative, and we'll send that out to bid. And we're going to rebid the vast majority of our contracts this year. So we expect to see a big difference very soon. One thing that the community did for us, the Garden Club gave us a very good list of native plants. We're working with that list, and we're incorporating those into our existing landscaping now. And we also want to develop a couple areas that really showcase native plants and be an opportunity for the residents to see what alternatives are out there besides the ornamentals that we've been using so much.
Fantastic. Oh, my gosh. That was a big package of jewelry in a short period of time there. Thank you so much. So I just want to thank the panelists so much for coming, making the trip here. It was fantastic.